It was New Year's Eve, 1980, in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. The air was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your bones ache. But inside the bars and restaurants, it was a different world. It was warm, loud, and full of hope for the year to come. 20-year-old Karen Podek was right in the middle of it all, celebrating with a group of her closest friends. She was a young woman with a bright future, full of life and laughter, and that night was all about saying goodbye to the old year and ringing in the new one with the people she cared about. They laughed, they danced, they made toasts. It was a perfect New Year's Eve. But as the night wore on, the energy started to wane. Karen wasn't a big partier, and she decided she'd had enough. She didn't want to make a big deal out of leaving, so she just quietly slipped out of the bar. Planning to walk the short distance home, she stepped out into the frigid Minnesota night, and the cold hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't worn a proper jacket, a decision she instantly regretted. The streets were mostly empty now, the sounds of celebration muffled by the distance and the thick, cold air. She started her walk home, her steps a little unsteady from the drink she'd had, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. As she stumbled along, a car slowed down beside her. A man leaned over from the driver's seat and rolled down the passenger window. He offered her a ride. In her slightly intoxicated state and with the cold biting at her skin, the offer sounded like a lifesaver. It was a stranger, yes, but he seemed friendly enough. She was cold, she was tired, and she just wanted to be home. So she got in the car. The door clicked shut behind her, and the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the dark, quiet streets. A couple of hours later, around 3 in the morning, the phone rang at the emergency dispatch center. A man's voice, frantic and panicked, came through the line. He was speaking quickly, his words tumbling over each other. He told the dispatcher there was an emergency, that they needed to send a police squad and an ambulance to the Menberg Manufacturing Company machine shop on Pierce Butler Route. He said there was a girl there, that she was hurt. The dispatcher tried to get more information, asking what had happened to her. But the man on the phone was evasive. He just kept repeating, "Just hurry." He said she was lying on the ground in the back, by the railroad tracks. When the dispatcher pressed for an address or for the caller's name, the man claimed he didn't know the exact address. And when asked who he was, the line went dead. He had hung up, police and paramedics were dispatched immediately to the location. The area around the machine shop was industrial, deserted, and dark. It was not a place someone would be walking through at 3 in the morning. As they searched the back of the building, near the desolate stretch of railroad tracks, their flashlights cut through the darkness and landed on a figure on the ground. It was Karen Podek. She was unconscious, barely breathing. She had been brutally attacked, bludgeoned over the head repeatedly with what looked like a tire iron. It was a miracle she was still alive. Paramedics rushed to stabilize her, working quickly in the freezing cold before carefully moving her into the ambulance and speeding off to the hospital. Karen survived the attack, but the cost was immense. The severe trauma to her head had caused significant memory loss. When detectives tried to speak with her, she couldn't remember anything about that night. She remembered being at the bar with her friends, she remembered feeling happy. But everything after that was a complete blank. She had no memory of leaving the bar, no memory of the man who offered her a ride, and certainly no memory of the horrific attack that had nearly ended her life. The man who picked her up was their only lead, and he was a ghost. He was also, most likely, the same man who had made that panicked 911 call, a strange act of what seemed like remorse or maybe just a twisted part of his game. The police had very little to go on. They canvassed the desolate area where Karen was found, but it was an industrial park. There were no residents, no late-night businesses with potential witnesses. It was a ghost town after dark. The crime scene itself yielded no physical evidence. No weapon, no fingerprints, no footprints in the frozen ground. The case was a frustrating dead end from the very beginning. With a victim who couldn't remember her attacker and a crime scene that offered no clues, the investigation stalled. The brutal attack on Karen Podek officially went cold. The police could only hope that the attacker would make a mistake, that some new piece of information would surface. They had no idea that they would hear from him again, and that next time, it would be even worse. 5 months passed. Spring arrived in Minnesota, melting the snow and bringing life back to the city. The memory of the New Year's Eve attack on Karen Podek had faded for the public, but for the detectives who worked the case, it remained an unsolved, nagging puzzle. Then, one day, another strange call came into the police dispatch. The voice on the other end was male, but this time it wasn't panicked. It was distressed, emotional, and filled with a chilling self-loathing. The man's voice was shaky, as if he were crying. He spoke in a soft, almost whimpering tone. He told the dispatcher, "Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody else." The call was deeply disturbing. The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line, to get a location, a name, anything. But just like before, the caller offered no useful information. He didn't say where he was or where his victim could be found. He just made his confession and then hung up, leaving the police with a terrifying but vague claim. At this point, the police didn't connect this new, weepy-voiced caller with the frantic caller from the Karen Podek case. The tones were different, and there was no immediate evidence to link them. Without a body or a location, the call was just a disturbing piece of information, logged and noted, but not something they could actively investigate. They had no way of knowing that the man on the phone had been telling the absolute truth. Just a few hours after that chilling call, the terrible reality of his words came to light. A group of teenagers were walking through a wooded area, just enjoying the spring day, when they stumbled upon something horrifying. Lying partially hidden in the undergrowth was the body of a young woman. The police were called to the scene, and the victim was quickly identified as 18-year-old Kimberly Compton. She had been stabbed to death. An autopsy would later confirm the weapon was consistent with an ice pick. The call from the whimpering man suddenly became the single most important piece of evidence in a new murder investigation. Detectives began to piece together Kimberly's last hours. What they discovered was a story of heartbreaking innocence and bad luck. Kimberly had literally just arrived in Minnesota. She was a recent high school graduate who had decided to leave her old life behind and start fresh. She had packed her bags, bought a bus ticket, and traveled to the Twin Cities with dreams of a new beginning. She didn't know a single soul in the state. After getting off the bus, she had walked into the first restaurant she saw, a small, unassuming diner. She sat by herself at a table, probably feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness about the new chapter of her life. While she was eating, a man approached her table. He asked if he could join her. Kimberly, being friendly and perhaps a little lonely in this new city, said yes. They started talking. She told him her story, that she had just moved to town and didn't know her way around. The man seemed kind and offered to show her the sights, to give her a tour of her new city. For a young woman in a strange place, it must have seemed like a wonderful gesture of kindness. She agreed. She left the diner with him, getting into his car, likely believing she had made her first friend in Minnesota. It was a fatal mistake. Just 15 minutes after they drove away from that diner, he killed her, stabbing her with an ice pick and leaving her body in the woods for those teenagers to find. The police now had two horrific attacks on young women 5 months apart. With the two phone calls, they started to suspect they were dealing with the same person. The first caller was frantic, the second was full of remorse, but both had led them to a victim. It seemed their attacker had a bizarre compulsion to confess his crimes, even if he wouldn't give himself up. The investigation into Kimberly's murder was in full swing, but just 2 days after her body was found, the killer called again. And this time, he confirmed their suspicions. The same weepy, distraught voice came over the line. He said, "Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. I don't know why I had this tavern. I am so upset about it." His voice cracked with emotion. "I keep getting drunk every day and I can't believe it. Feels like a big dream. I just can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else." And then he hung up. The call sent a shiver down the spine of everyone who heard it. He had named his victim Kimberly Compton. He had confirmed he was the killer. And he had promised to try not to kill again, a promise that no one in law enforcement believed for a second. The media got wind of the calls, and the public soon learned about the man who taunted police with his tearful confessions. They gave him a name that stuck, the weepy-voiced killer. The police now had his voice on tape, a crucial piece of evidence. They went back to the diner where Kimberly was last seen and spoke with the staff who were working that day. They were able to provide a general description of the man she left with, but it was broad. He was an average-looking white male, not particularly memorable. It wasn't enough to narrow down a list of suspects from the thousands of men in the city who fit that description. The investigation hit another wall. They had the killer's voice, a vague physical description, and his method of operation, but they didn't have a name. They didn't have any physical evidence from the Compton crime scene either. He was careful. He left no fingerprints, no fibers, nothing that could identify him. The city was on edge. A killer was stalking the streets, a man who could sound friendly one moment and turn deadly the next, a man who was then compelled to cry about it to the very people who were hunting him. For 6 long months, the city waited in fear. The weepy-voiced killer went silent. There were no more attacks, no more calls. Some hoped he had stopped or maybe even followed through on his threat to take his own life. But the detectives knew better. Killers like this don't just stop. They were just waiting for the next call, the next victim, and then it happened. The phone at the dispatch center rang again. The dispatcher who answered heard the same horribly familiar whimpering voice. "Please don't talk, just listen," the man began, his standard opening line. "I'm sorry. I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. The number of stab wounds was a new, brutal detail. Kimberly Compton was the first one over. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself. I'm just going to die with me. I killed them both." He was now claiming another victim. The call ended as abruptly as the others, leaving police scrambling. He said he'd killed again, but he hadn't said who or where. They had to wait. A day later, they found her. The body of a woman was found floating in the Mississippi River, caught in some brush near the bank. She was identified as 40-year-old Barbara Simons. The night before she was found, Barbara had been out at a local bar, just enjoying a casual evening. She was a regular there, known for being friendly and outgoing. At some point during the night, she struck up a conversation with a man she'd never met before. It started simply enough. She offered him a cigarette. They began talking, flirting, and seemed to hit it off. They spent a good part of the evening together, and it was clear to everyone at the bar that they were enjoying each other's company. As the night came to a close, they decided to leave together. Just before they walked out the door, Barbara turned to one of the waitresses, a woman she knew well. With a smile and a little laugh, she said something that would prove to be tragically prophetic. "Boy, I hope he's nice," she joked, "because I'm leaving with him." For some reason, that comment and the man she was with gave the waitress a bad feeling. It was just a gut instinct, an inexplicable sense of unease. She couldn't shake it. So, as Barbara and the man walked out, the waitress made a conscious effort to get a really good look at him. She studied his face, his build, his clothes. She committed his features to memory. Not knowing that she was witnessing the final moments of Barbara Simons's life, as soon as Barbara and the man left the bar, he attacked her. He stabbed her to death, just as he had told the police, and then he dumped her body in the cold, dark waters of the Mississippi River. The investigation immediately led police to the bar where Barbara was last seen. They spoke to the staff, and the waitress with the bad feeling came forward. She told them everything. She told them about the man Barbara left with, about her own sense of dread. And then she gave them the break they had been praying for. She said, "I got a really good look at this guy. I would know him if I saw him again." This was the first real lead they'd had in the entire case. The detectives knew this was their chance. They brought the waitress down to the station and sat her down with book after book of mugshots. They showed her hundreds of photos of known felons in the area. She looked at each one carefully, her face a mask of concentration. Page after page, she shook her head, and then she stopped. Her finger landed on one of the photos. She looked up at the detectives, her eyes certain. "That's him," she said. "That's the guy." The man in the picture was a 38-year-old named Paul Michael Stefani. The name immediately raised red flags. Paul Stefani had a criminal record, including a conviction for aggravated assault. He also had a documented history of mental illness. He fit the profile. The police finally had a name and a face to go with the weepy voice that had been haunting them for over a year. They immediately put Paul Stefani under 24/7 surveillance. They needed to be careful. They wanted to catch him in the act, or at least gather more evidence to solidify their case. He was their only suspect, and they couldn't afford to let him slip away, but Stefani was slippery. Within just 24 hours of the surveillance starting, he managed to give his police tail the slip. He disappeared into the busy streets of downtown Minneapolis. The detectives were frantic. They knew what he was capable of. They feared the worst, and their fears were justified. After shaking his surveillance, Stefani went straight back to his hunting ground. He drove through the city until he found his next target, a 19-year-old street worker named Denise Williams. He pulled up alongside her and offered her a ride. She got in. Stefani drove her to a dark, secluded alleyway. As he turned off the main road and the car plunged into darkness, Denise sensed that something was terribly wrong. The friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and menacing. Her survival instincts kicked in. She looked around the car, desperate for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on a glass bottle sitting on the floor of the car. As Stefani made his move, lunging at her, she grabbed the bottle. She fought back with everything she had. She smashed the bottle over his head, the glass shattering. She used the jagged edge to cut his face, fighting for her life in the cramped confines of the car. The attack was brutal, but Denise's fierce resistance was something Stefani hadn't counted on. She managed to wound him badly enough that she could break free. She threw the car door open and scrambled out, running for her life down the dark alley, screaming for help. A neighbor heard the commotion and saw her running from the car. They saw the whole exchange and, sensing how wrong it looked, immediately called 911. By the time police arrived, Paul Stefani was long gone, but Denise Williams was alive. She was the one who got away. That very same night, the phone rang again at the police dispatch. But this call was different from all the others. The weepy-voiced killer wasn't calling to confess to a murder. He was calling for help for himself. The dispatcher answered and heard a man's voice, pained and gasping. He said, "I need an ambulance." The dispatcher asked for his location. He gave an address, 1505 Westminster. He said he was all cut up, that he'd been beat up. He gave his apartment number 208 and told them he was bleeding from his arm, his face, his head. By this time, the police had released the audio recordings of the killer's previous calls to the public. His distinctive, weepy voice had been played on the radio and on television news. People all over the Twin Cities had heard it. And the dispatcher who took this call for an ambulance recognized it instantly. A chill ran down their spine. It was him. It was the weepy voice killer. The dispatcher calmly continued the call while simultaneously alerting police. They told their supervisor, "I think the weepy voice killer just called us." An ambulance was dispatched to the address Paul Stefani had given, and so were the police. They found him in his apartment, just as he'd said, bleeding from the cuts Denise Williams had inflicted on him during her desperate fight for survival. He was taken to the hospital to be treated for his injuries. But as he sat in his hospital bed, bandages on his face and arm, a group of police officers walked into his room. They placed him under arrest for the murder of Barbara Simons. The hunt for the weepy-voiced killer was finally over. Paul Stefani pleaded not guilty. The case against him went to trial, but the prosecution faced a challenge. They didn't have a lot of hard physical evidence directly linking him to all of the attacks. What they did have was the powerful testimony of the waitress who had positively identified him as the man who left the bar with Barbara Simons, and, most importantly, they had the audio recordings of the phone calls. Voice print analysis was still a developing field, but experts testified that the voice on the tapes was a match for Paul Stefani. The jury was convinced. He was found guilty. While he wasn't given a life sentence, he was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Given that he was already 38 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. He would almost certainly die behind bars. For 12 years, Paul Stefani sat in prison, maintaining his innocence. The families of his victims had justice, but not the full truth. There were still questions. Was he responsible for the attack on Karen Potak? Were there other victims the police didn't know about? It seemed those questions might never be answered. Then, 12 years into his sentence, Stefani was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer. Doctors told him he had at most a year to live. Faced with his own mortality, something inside Paul Stefani changed. The man who had denied everything for over a decade decided it was time to confess. He admitted to everything. He told detectives that yes, he was the one who had brutally attacked Karen Potak on that New Year's Eve so long ago. He confessed to murdering Kimberly Compton, the young woman who had just arrived in the city with so much hope. He confessed to murdering Barbara Simons. He admitted that it was his voice on all those chilling phone calls, but he didn't stop there. He revealed a crime that police had never even connected to him. He confessed to the murder of a 33-year-old woman named Kathleen Greening. She had been found murdered in her own home, but the case had gone cold with no suspects. Stefani admitted he had killed her too, but for whatever reason, he hadn't made his signature weepy phone call to the police afterward. It was a final, horrifying revelation that showed the true extent of his violence. Shortly after his full confession, Paul Stefani died in prison, taking any other secrets he might have had to the grave. The case was officially closed, but the memory of the weepy-voiced killer, the man who murdered and then cried about it, left a permanent scar on the community he had terrorized. The haunting sound of his voice on those tapes serves as a chilling reminder of the monster who once walked their streets, a man who found his victims at random and then sought a strange, twisted form of absolution by confessing to the very people sworn to bring him to justice. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya! Tab 1 in 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top attractions in Hawaii, drawing over 2 million yearly visitors. A major draw is that it is home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, Kilauea, which has been erupting consistently since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally had some time off, so he drove his rental car out to the park. When he got there, he was pleased to see it was not crowded, likely because it was midweek. He paid his entrance fee and started walking up a trail toward an overlook of the caldera. The caldera is the actual crater, the inside where the lava comes out. At the time, the volcano was not actively erupting, so there was no lava pool inside. However, the surface of the caldera, 300 feet below, was still over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, causing massive steam clouds to billow up constantly. When John reached the overlook, he was disappointed because he could not see anything through the thick steam. He was standing against a safety railing that kept people back, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of the crater, he might look down to the base. Seeing no other tourists around, he decided to do this. He stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge. Once there, he had an unencumbered view of the space directly below. He could actually see down into the caldera now, so he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Suddenly, the ground underneath him shifted so quickly that it threw him onto his back. As he scrambled to get up, the earth completely collapsed, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding caldera. Another tourist on a nearby trail saw him fall and called 911. Rescuers were quickly on the scene, but they faced the same intense steam. They had searchers along the rim and helicopters in the air, but the fog blocked their view. Everyone knew that realistically, nobody could survive a 300-foot fall, let alone onto a caldera floor that was over 2,000 degrees. They assumed he would die within minutes, but the rescuers kept searching. 2 hours later, in the pitch black, someone spotted John on a tiny ledge jutting out 70 feet down the cliff. When the ground dissolved, he had landed perfectly on this single rock outcropping. Had he fallen an inch in any other direction, he would have tumbled to his death. He was badly injured and could not climb up, but rescuers rappelled down, put him in a harness, and pulled him to safety. Miraculously, John made a full recovery. On July 12, 2015, 30-year-old Christopher Lasson was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile on the ocean floor, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first. But as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be some sort of underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater, and they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided it was inconsequential and they could just go down and check it out for themselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over to read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris did not read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. After only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there was not just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so, Chris and Robert looked at each other and they were totally amazed at what they were looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they had spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so, they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple of feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. There were almost like windows at the top of the structure, and across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so, Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of this structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside, and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so, Chris was really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabbed the mesh itself and just kind of tried to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move to maybe create some space so he could look inside. It very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he and Robert to go through. And so the 2 of them looked at each other and they just nodded, because they knew they wanted to go inside and see what was in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space. It was a 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was a 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. From where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they could not see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris went down first, followed by Robert. As they started making their way down, they both started to feel a current that was pulling them straight down. As soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they did not want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position because the current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch-black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he was going to encounter some very powerful pump that was sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that had something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. In both of those situations, once Chris reached the end of this tunnel, he was going to get cut up and get killed. And so, Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just could not bring himself to do it. And so, he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask, and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly saw a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction he was being pulled towards. All he could think of was, okay, well, whatever that light was, that was the area where I am going to get killed. He thought there would be some pump or some turbine right out there, and so he was bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as he got closer and closer, and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture. Every time he would tumble around, he would get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit-up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface, where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where, instead of just pulling the water directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be a pump of death or spinning turbines, instead, there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped. And then, after a while, that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built. Because in many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they did not put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes. The power plant countered by saying they put up enough deterrents and that he had just gone past them on purpose. As of now, it is unclear what came of that court case, but Christopher survived to tell the tale and warning other divers to always read and respect the warning signs on surface buoys. In 1990, 46-year-old Alex Kirstich was a marine biology high school teacher by day and a documentary filmmaker by night. In July of that year, he and 3 of his friends were in Mexico working on a documentary about sea life in the Gulf of California. They had already shot a bunch of footage during the daytime, and now they needed to go out and get some nighttime footage as well. On the evening of the 25th, Alex and his 3 friends boarded a 70-foot research vessel with all of their diving and camera equipment. They waited until just before sunset to leave the harbor, and then it was a 30-minute transit to this area just north of La Paz that they had been told was very active at night. Once the ship was stopped, they threw their anchor down and then turned on these bright spotlights and aimed them into the water. And then, one of the ship's crew members put a big piece of tuna onto his fishing rod and then cast it out into the water to try to lure some animals to the area. A few moments later, a black mass suddenly came up to the surface, ripped the tuna from the line, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alex and his 3 friends did not get a good look at it. They saw it happen, but they had no idea what it was. So they told the ship crew member to put another piece of tuna on the line, throw it out there, and see if they could get a better look at this thing. And so, more tuna was put on the rod, it was cast out, and then seconds later, a black mass rushed up to the surface, grabbed the tuna, and then went back down again. But this time, with Alex and the others looking really intently at it, they picked up what looked like a red and white flash, like a strobe light on the skin of this creature as it descended down below. They looked at each other and they thought, could it be? And so, another piece of tuna was put on the fishing rod, they cast it out into the water, and this time, before anything could come up and take it deep down below, they saw a flash of red and white all over the place, like a bunch of strobe lights going off. And then, dozens of these creatures rocketed to the surface, fought over this tuna, and then descended back down into the deep water. And so now the men looked at each other and they were grinning, because they knew the red and white flashing they were seeing was a trademark of a very rare creature. It was their skin-changing colors, which is how they communicate with each other. This creature was so rare that at this time, no one had actually filmed it alive. There was only footage of it dead after it washed up on shore. And so suddenly Alex and his team were thinking, man, our documentary is about to become legendary if we can just get in there and get the footage. And so the men eagerly put on their dive equipment, got their cameras, and prepared to enter the water. Had they consulted with anyone who studied this rare creature, they would have been told that getting in the water with them was a horrible idea and could easily get them killed. These rare creatures are called Humboldt squids, and they are 8-foot-long apex predators that live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Because they almost never come up to the shallow waters, we know very little about them. What we do know is that, like all other squids, they have 8 arms along with 2 long tentacles that have all these suckers on them. And inside of the suckers are these teeth, these little daggers that they use to latch on to their prey. They pull their prey in towards their center, and at their center is this opening, which is their mouth, and it is called a beak. It literally looks like a bird's beak. It is this hard thing that sits there and opens and shuts, and they use it to bite into their prey. And then, inside of their beak is their tongue, and on their tongue are hundreds of sharp little daggers like more teeth that they also use to shred their prey. Typically, these jumbo squid will sneak underneath their prey and then suddenly shoot up, grab them with their 2 tentacles, and then drag them down to the deeper water where they feel safe. And then they begin the horrifyingly slow process of eating their prey alive because they have a gag reflex that prevents them from eating quickly. Humboldt squids are very intelligent, they are very social, and they are very aggressive towards humans, especially when they are in a large group or when they are eating. But of course, Alex and his 3 friends were not thinking about this. They were just eager to get into those jumbo squid-infested waters and get this footage. And so they gave each other the final okays, they were ready, their equipment was good to go, and they slipped off the side of the boat into the water. Once they were in the water, they sank down to 30 feet, at which point they spread out around the squid that were still darting up to the edge of the boat to try to get more tuna. After a few minutes of Alex and his buddies taking this great footage of these squids, a 14-foot shark suddenly came into the mix and tried to eat the tuna off the side of the boat. But ironically, on its way out after not getting any tuna, the shark got its tail fin stuck on the actual hook and then became bait for the Humboldt squids. Seconds later, the squids began ripping the shark apart, and so Alex and his 3 friends decided to move closer to the drama to get some great footage. As Alex was right up next to this drama unfolding, he felt himself suddenly sinking in the water. He was kind of fixated on getting this shot, so he was not really worried about why he was sinking. He was thinking maybe his buoyancy compensator was off, or maybe his weights were too heavy. But when he looked down, he realized in horror that a Humboldt squid had wrapped one of its tentacles around his right swim fin. And so he instinctively began kicking the squid's tentacle with his left leg, and he got it to release him. In a panic, Alex began swimming back up towards the surface, but he was still 40 feet away at this point from the boat. And at this point, the other squids had been alerted to Alex as now being considered prey. And so as Alex was going up from behind, another squid came up and wrapped its tentacle around his neck. His neck was the only area on his body that was not protected by his neoprene wetsuit. And so the daggers inside of these suckers on this tentacle dug into his neck all around his throat. His neck was being cut into and he was being strangled and pulled down by the squid. And so Alex began punching and squeezing and pulling on this tentacle, fighting for his life, and he managed to get this second squid to release him. But by now, he had been pulled down to 50 feet. He had a ways to go to get back to the boat, and the other squids were all coming over. They were converging on him because they were all communicating that here was their prey, here was their other meal. And so Alex tried to swim as fast as he could back to the boat, but he only made it a few feet before another Humboldt squid darted up and came right up to his face. It wrapped both tentacles around his entire head, blinding him, and he immediately felt the beak pressed up against his face. It was opening and closing, trying to bite him, but it was biting down on his dive mask, which was basically saving him from having his skull crushed by the squid. The squid became frustrated because it was not digging into Alex's flesh, and so it readjusted its grip on him by sliding down to his midsection, where immediately it began pulling him down violently in these pulsing bursts. And so, all Alex started doing was punching and hitting and doing everything he can to get this thing off of him. And then for some reason it did release him, maybe because it was just so frustrated that it could not puncture into him. And so Alex was now down to about 60 feet, and he started swimming as fast as he could with all these squids all around him, but for some reason none of them attacked him again. And so Alex swam up to the boat, and before he actually got on board, he looked down back into the water. There were just dozens of these squids that were flashing red and white at each other, just kind of hovering in the water, not making any move towards him. It was like they were just watching him. Alex sprinted up that ladder, got into the boat, and shortly after, his 3 friends came out of the water as well. They were unharmed. Alex had deep cuts all around his neck from where the tentacles had driven their teeth into his throat, but besides that, he was physically okay. Mentally, he was a train wreck and was very traumatized from this event, as you could imagine. Today, his encounter with the jumbo squids is a thing of legend in the diving community. It forever changed the way underwater filmmakers and marine biologists interact with Humboldt squids, proving that these deep-sea predators are not to be underestimated. These 3 extraordinary tales of near-death survival remind us of how fragile life really is when we venture into the unknown. Whether we are walking along the edge of an active volcano in Hawaii, exploring deep-water man-made structures off the coast of Florida, or diving with rare apex predators in Mexico, a single split-second decision can be the difference between making a miraculous recovery or meeting a tragic end. The sheer unpredictability of our world means that danger often hides behind ordinary curiosity. John, Christopher, and Alex each faced moments where hope seemed entirely lost, but their instincts and a massive amount of luck allowed them to live to tell their stories, leaving us with lessons on caution and survival that we will never forget. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Tosher 3 men entered places humans were never meant to survive. John stepped past a volcano railing in Hawaii, then the earth vanished beneath him. Christopher ignored a buoy and was sucked into a dark underwater tunnel near a nuclear plant. Alex dove toward flashing red and white creatures in Mexico, only to realize the hunters were Humboldt squids. The suspects seemed obvious: the volcano, the current, the monsters below. But the twist? Each man should have died within seconds, yet impossible luck saved them. One landed on a tiny ledge, one shot out alive inside a power plant, one escaped the squid swarm with his throat bleeding. Want the full terrifying stories? Visit the channel now.